Hello, writers. Have you ever bought a writing craft book someone says you just have to read?
Is it still sitting on your shelf? Have you even cracked the spine?
That's totally me.
Don't ask Renee how many craft books she owns.
Why do we keep buying these books we never read?
We all want to improve as writers, but that's hard to do alone.
That's why we started the Words to Write By podcast, to tackle these books together, chapter by chapter, and learn from their advice.
Or not. Sometimes they're wrong.
Hi, I'm Renee Nelson, former college writing instructor turned full-time writer and podcaster. After many years, I finally have a complete draft of my memoir.
And I'm Kim Smuga-Otto, author of the humorous fantasy series Boy Bands and Dragons. The first book, Our Comeback Tour Slaying Monsters, will be released this year by Riverfolk Publishing.
And now, on with the podcast. Hi all, welcome to Words to Write By.
Hello.
How's it going, everybody? Not that you can answer back, but if you did, you might be saying, writing's kind of a lonely thing. And I would say, well, it just so happens that we have a process group that happens every Wednesday now. It only lasts an hour. You can find it on Meetup, or you can go to our website and click on the poster. It's 5 p.m. Pacific time. I don't know what time that is somewhere else, but I'm sure people are used to that kind of thing now that we all know the internet.
And if you're looking for a link, you can go to our website, wordstowritebypodcast.com, or if you use Meetup, we have the Words to Write By podcast
Meetup
group right there. Okay,
on with the show.
So we are reading Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, and we are going through the steps of the hero's journey, the monomyth, hero with 1,000 faces, yada, yada, yada.
Yada, yada.
We have covered the entire hero's journey in an earlier podcast. Renee has a fantastic study guide. And we're going to do stage 4 and stage 5 today.
Let's do a quick recap. Can you remember the first 3 stages?
Ordinary world, the call, refusal to call.
That's 3.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So yeah, you can get those episodes. We have 2 episodes dedicated to those 3 steps. And now we're doing the next 2, 4, and 5.
I kind of feel like the meeting with the mentor is sort of double dipping, considering that we had the whole archetype of the mentor earlier.
That's weird. Well, I guess because the step comes with a potential character, right?
Right.
So,
which means the chapter's actually pretty short compared to some of them, because we've covered like all the variations of what the mentor represents and, the roles the mentor can have and various types of mentors. We've covered all those details.
Yeah, we have a podcast on that.
So we're just talking about meeting the mentor, the actual structural part of your adventure story.
Yeah, like what does it serve in terms of plot? Not so much character, but plot.
Right. So what he says in the book is that the mentor has many services to the hero, which includes protecting, guiding, teaching, testing, training, and providing magical gifts. We covered all that stuff in the archetype. But critically, what it says is the mentor is the stage of the hero's journey at which the hero gains the supplies, knowledge, and confidence needed to overcome fear and commence with the adventure. So it's often gathering knowledge, but it's also basically preparing the hero to be the hero. There's all this stuff about the mentor as a character, but then there is the stage. Then this is what the stage is. And like, how do you see this sage?
It's the D&D tavern, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you have to go to the tavern. Actually, that's the part I hate the most in when I played role-playing games, was everyone would go to the tavern and they would meet the appropriate people they needed to meet, or they would just start gathering all these supplies and asking all these questions, and I would fall asleep.
Yeah.
So,
but I think one of the important things I was realizing, it's not just an info dump. It's not just getting everybody prepped. There has to be something where the hero who has been this nobody in an ordinary world suddenly is prepared to take on the challenge.
Right. This is like an extension of that pause that we talked about in the previous episode, where the author's kind of pausing and preparing the hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also wrote that structurally, this is the point where the hero has to be active, not passive, and they need to be capable, and they need to be invested in the adventure. And this kind of leads to the next stage as well. But I think to really get the most out of the meeting the mentor, it has to be more than just information. Otherwise, Renee falls asleep in the tavern.
I do. I fall asleep in the tavern.
Yeah.
Yeah. I check out and I don't want to play Dungeons and Dragons anymore. All right. So there's some interesting themes he discovered. Like there's this one where he says heroes and mentors, where the hero and mentor, it's a journey for both of them. So the mentor is almost as much as a character as the hero, and they go on the kind of the adventure together. And he brought up the Karate Kid, and I was like, oh yeah, definitely.
Right, because the master does have some stake in the whole situation because it was his former pupil that, runs the other dojo and stuff like that, right?
They were never, he was never his student.
All right. But the sensei has a stake. It's not like you just sends the Karate Kid on his way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
I kind of saw this really as the, in one of our books we wrote previously for the archetypes, the last unicorn, and Schmendrick the wizard is the mentor, but he's also on a journey of his own.
Yeah. Molly Grew, she dipped into the mentor thing. We had a whole episode on the mentor.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about the last unicorn.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, so structurally, the meeting the mentor step is critical to the telling of the story. But as you bring up, emotionally, it's really important. Humans have complex relationships with mentors in their own lives, and the audience wants the person or the mentor to have a story to them, have some more element than just showing up and giving information, because you can find that in a book.
Yeah, the mentor kind of delivers all of that stuff that the hero needs to know to either commit to the journey or to know what they're getting into, so then they can be active.
Mm-hmm.
He does mention this source of wisdom, and they have to make some kind of contact with it, but then they mention that it doesn't have to be a person. I liked that.
That goes to the structural. The hero needs to gain knowledge, but when the mentor isn't a person, if it still has that same emotional connection that we have with a mentor character.
So here, I'm thinking of the movie Goonies, as I really liked it. I'm of that generation. So the Vogler says, the hero will consult a map of the adventure. They'll look for records or charts, ship logs of that territory, or various other things, right? They'll talk to people who've had experience before. In Goonies, there's no mentor. He's a ghost, really. It's One-Eyed Willie. But One-Eyed Willie, he's dead. It's this kid's imagination of kind of who this pirate was. There's this legend of, him hiding his treasure somewhere off the coast, and he finds the map. Mm-hmm. And the map is the guide.
Yeah.
There's even like a trove. They found somebody else who was looking for the treasure, and they looked him up. And then when they get inside the cave, they find him and Copperpot, I think his name was, or something. And he had some extra stuff.
Yeah.
To me, you don't actually have to have a mentor character to guide the hero. It could be like, research.
Yeah.
It could be something else that helps either get the hero on their adventure or guides them through their adventure.
Yeah. And that would suffice for the stage, getting them information, right. Meeting the mentors, getting that information to go on. Okay, so then we go into a bunch of sections talking about folklore and myth, and almost all of them seem to be Greek myths.
He's got this thing with the Greek myths. He's even got a whole 8-paragraph or 5-paragraph thing about Chiron or Chiron, a prototype.
Yes.
It makes no sense.
And then they've got the actual word mentor comes from a Greek myth. I loved it that this section is called Mentor Himself, but the section actually is talking about how Athena took on a female goddess, took on the appearance of mentor to do all the stuff that had to happen. So it would have been really cool if he had said mentor him/herself.
Yeah, or themself.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be nice. Hey, Vogler, if you're listening to this, we fixed that for you.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. So, yeah, he's got this stuff that really doesn't help understanding anything. He does a close analysis of some Greek mythology, which draws attention to the fact that this hero's journey is very Western. I know that Campbell, looked at all the world mythologies and essentially found this. Honestly, I think that might just be his Western interpretation of them.
These things are always someone's interpretation.
Right. You can't
something.
escape your own interpretation of something. But Vogler has whittled it down to a very Western style storytelling journey.
This book is for screenwriters that write American-style adventure movies for a Western audience. So, kind of makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, he focuses on Greek mythology, which would be considered a Western kind of mythology.
To bring this up, sorry, it's a little small tangent. One of our other podcasts, we talk about the heroine's journey and the differences between the hero and the heroine's journey, a more female perspective. And in a little less than a month, we are going to be at World Fantasy Con, and we have a panel on the heroine's journey.
Yay!
So if you happen to be in the Niagara Falls area in over the 16th through the 20th of October, there's a con there. We'll be there.
Yep. Hope to see y'all there.
Okay.
Avoiding mentor cliches.
I did appreciate the fact that he basically tells us to defy the archetypes.
Right. Sure. I mean, it's weird because he hammers down that we should do these things. And then he says, but don't do them. So obviously, it's like, okay, thanks, dude.
So the main part of that paragraph says, it doesn't always have to be a kindly fairy godmother or a white-beard wizard in a tall Merlin hat. Then he goes on to talk about a few things. This kind of matches with what was previously in the archetype section, because he was talking about variations on the archetype. So he was talking about misdirection, where, the mentor misleads the hero. Like in the Dickens with the Orphan.
Oliver Twist?
So like in Oliver Twist, where the mentor is actually a shady crime lord.
Yeah. Didn't Marvel play with that in, what's the one with the raccoon? Guardians of the Galaxy. The main character is taken in by that kind of rascally mercenary pirate guy. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was a mentor, definitely.
Well, he's presented as actually trouble all the way through, and then there's implied that there's a...
Right, but he took him in as his son.
Mm-hmm. That was a father figure theme more than a mentor theme.
But he taught him everything he knew. Anyway, I thought they played with it a little bit. They made him not great, and then he turned out to be okay.
Yeah, he actually turned out to be pretty sweet in the end.
Yeah, especially in the sequels.
Yeah. Well, that's because as you progress further and further from your original source, you make everybody nicer and nicer because people really like the actors and they want to see fun stuff.
That's true.
Yes, it's always easier on them. And then he goes through some different things you can do to play around with it. You can have the hero betray the mentor. You can have the mentor be evil. You can have the mentor disappoint the hero. Or you can have the mentor that has a problem letting go. Like, these are all kind of variations, ways of making the mentor more of a character in the story than just a deliverer of information.
Since we're talking about father figures, it reminds me of like stories that have like a very rigid father figure. Like, this is the only way it must be. And that's usually their downfall. And then the hero has to learn to like break free of their father's rigid mold. Mm-hmm. I don't have an example.
That's a pretty common one.
Anyway, so we got mentor-hero conflicts. That's kind of what that is.
I think this chapter really suffers from the fact that we've kind of covered this all before, and there's not that much new in here.
Right. Oh, so I did find something that was interesting. Mentors can be regarded as heroes who have become experienced enough to teach others. They have been down the road of heroes. We have talked about that in the archetype section, but I like that one a lot because you usually get a very varied, complex mentor.
Yeah.
Because they're old usually, they're grizzled, they're tired.
My younger son is plowing through the Hunger Games right now, and the mentor in that is the guy that survived the Hunger Games previously.
Haymitch, isn't his name?
Yeah, and, he's washed up and all that now, but, he still has that critical knowledge that, they need.
Right, and he's an alcoholic because, every year he just ends up killing them all. Well, he doesn't kill them, but they all end up dying anyway. So he doesn't want to get attached to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if Collins, is that her last name?
Susanna Collins?
Susanna Collins. I wonder if she read this book. I wonder if she based it off this. It hits a lot of the same.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Almost all stories have a mentor because structurally you need to move your hero from a stage where they aren't prepared to a stage where they are prepared. So structurally, you need to have something that teaches them, someone that teaches them. And then once you already have this kind of person with a structural role, you come up with an emotional connection. So the people reading the book don't just see this as an information dump, but actually are invested in the secondary character that's guiding the hero or is doing things to help the hero on their journey, whether the motivation is right or whether they're doing a good job or any of these other things. They're still have this structural role, and then you as the author make it interesting through the emotional connections. In this case, making the mentor a washed up alcoholic that, you know, that may or may not actually be helping.
Right. You know, that's interesting because it also came with a training montage kind of thing. Like they actually went through training. Your book, there's actual training from mentors.
Yeah, well, training is a critical thing that the mentor does. And the training, as we'll discuss here, can either be all the beginning and then they kind of shove them on their way, or it could be that they get trained continually through the story up to a certain point.
Right.
Or they come back and get some more training later on.
Yeah. I thought of the training montage in a movie.
Yes.
Everyone enjoys the training montage.
It's got soundtrack and everything.
It's got a soundtrack. It's got like bloopers in it.
I had an interesting experience when I was doing writing my book, which was one of the dev edit comments was to maybe include a sort of montage of training and preparation and stuff.
In book form?
That was the thing. I had a hard time thinking about how can you do a montage in book form. And in the end, I really didn't. I chose not to.
Yeah, that's not a good idea. I'm glad that you didn't do that because I don't think that would work well in a book.
But it works so well in movies and TV series. We just love it.
Oh, I love me a good montage. Again, Marvel, one of the best ones was Captain America.
Before you get strong?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and he was the clever one. He was always clever.
It showed him getting beat down and rising back up again. So by the time they decide that he's the one they're going to pick,
right,
it makes sense.
There's this one scene with the flag. You had to get to the top and get the flag, and then he just pulls a pin out and makes the flag fall.
Yeah.
And then picks it up. That was probably the best Marvel movie ever. It was just so perfect. Anyway, we'll stop talking about Marvel.
And we're going to talk about some books. So the book we're using to look at all these steps, as you probably know, is Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. The first couple of stages were one stage per chapter. It was really easy, but I think we kind of got used to the fact that we wouldn't have to cover many chapters because I texted Renee and said, okay, so for this next 2 stages we're covering, you have to go all the way from chapter 4 to chapter 8.
Yeah. And I was trying to read on the couch and Max wouldn't leave me alone. So I had to read in the parking lot.
Before we start, let's give a quick rundown, or you can listen to the previous podcast. But what the setup is that Jamie, the hero, has accepted the job to go take care of large animals, and nothing else is said. And they are leaving their plague-filled New York, and they are going to Greenland, or they're going someplace. They don't even know where they're going. And that's where chapter 4 starts off.
There seems to be, these chapters seem to be their own little thresholds or decisions that the hero has to make to commit to the quest. Because they could back out at any time up into a certain point.
Did we decide? I mean, once they get picked up at the station, they really don't have much choice.
I guess so. I feel like he could have been like, I don't want to get on that dirigible thing, and just they would have taken him home. What are they going to do? Kill him?
They wouldn't have taken him home. They would have to turn the whole giant generator back on. No, he was
committed at this point.
And just to record, Jamie is never actually designated as a male or as a man or a woman.
Right.
So we try to use they, but sometimes it slips in.
Right. Okay.
So what we're talking right now about isn't the traveling. We're talking about the mentor. So Jamie really hasn't been told anything about what's going on. They have no knowledge. So this is the point where the meet the mentor stage happens, because this is when they finally find out what's going on.
Right.
So even though they accepted the call and they refused the call and all that, this is actually where they get the information, which I think is kind of a cool idea, that up to this point, we don't know what the heck's going on. So who do you think the mentor is?
In this chapter, it's Tom.
Yep, Tom Stevens.
That was his friend, right? That was helping him over.
Yeah, I mean, that was the person that recruited him, and they had a shared history. We don't actually know too much about Tom other than that he's recruiting Jamie to do this job. This book is really short on the backstory and really short on anything outside of the immediacy that's happening at that moment. So Tom is definitely the meeting the mentor here, and Tom is the person that tells him where they're going, which is Greenland. We're going to Greenland, I sputtered. Are we hanging out with polar bears? Do you notice anything in this chapter here or in the actions that Tom takes to be a mentor?
Well, he gives him rules. The usual rules apply. Do not talk about KPS business on the flight. When we arrive, KPS intake personnel will be there. Like, he gives him a breakdown of what's going to happen, what he's allowed to do and what he's not allowed to do.
Yeah, and how he's going to get there. You're going to wait in the lounge.
Right.
You're going to board the plane. You're going to go to this place here. You're going to surrender your clothes and put on this special jumpsuit. So he is guiding Jamie all the way through. And one thing that he won't do is he won't tell Jamie what's going to happen.
Right. He says, it's a tradition to not spoil the surprise. Trust us. Right. Trust us. It will be worth it. In the meantime, just know none of us knew either until we saw it with our own eyes.
And what does he see?
Kaiju.
So we'll get to that stage. This is intermixed, these two stages, because the next stage is crossing the threshold, which I think the actual arrival at the alternative Earth is definitely a crossing the threshold. But that is Tom's role. And he continues to explain to Jamie what this world is, how it exists, or how they think it exists, why they call them kaiju, how that all came about. There's a lot of information being dropped in the next chapter. So that's chapter 5, and then chapter 6. They got some more action stuff happening. At that point, we start shifting over to this threshold, passing the threshold. But I thought there was one other mentor that was kind of interesting, and that was more of an emotional mentor. At the very end of chapter 7, Jamie arrives where they'll be staying, and in their house that they're staying, in the room, they have a letter from the previous person that was there.
Which is kind of a person, but it's also just like a document.
Right. It is a document, but it's a letter from a person.
Right. Well, if we're talking about mentors, then there's also the other ones in the other chapters.
I mean, there's Bryn McDonald.
Yeah.
That tells them some information, but not too much information.
She's a mentor for everybody. She's telling everybody exactly like, okay, you guys are all scientists, and giving the background information. In fact, I thought it was quite clever. It was a way of info dumping without being annoying and info dumping. Uh-huh. So this is chapter 8.
Okay. Yeah.
Bryn McDonald, she is the mentor of backstory and information. That was my theory. Mm-hmm. If you're a nerd, nerds have questions, just as how it is, right? Mm-hmm. And Scalzi creates a different scientists to stand in for the nerd that's got these questions like, how is it possible that these creatures are so big? It breaks the laws of physics. And then Bryn's like, no, it doesn't. And not only is it's not annoying with a bunch of information that the reader wouldn't understand, because anyone could pick up this book and understand it. What she does is, here's the technical stuff in a binder, and she hands a binder over.
Yes.
Scalzi did a really good job of gauging who the reader was. And the reader is Jamie, in a way. And so Jamie needs to know these things, but how do you believably have a conversation between scientists that makes it sound like you're still having a conversation with scientists and not just layman people? And that's how he did it. And that's what I think Bryn is Bryn gives this information, is painting this world with its scariness and everything. And that is preparing the hero.
I agree with many of the points you bring up. I think you're right. It's a brilliant way to give that information. We see it through Jamie, but we're getting the scientist geek qualities. We're learning about the world as a whole. And Jamie is, in turn, learning about the world. But I didn't feel like Bryn had as much of a mentor role because she isn't as personal to Jamie. She's giving that information to all 4 of them. She's not giving information about the adventure. She's giving information about the world.
I understand that. I totally understand that. But that's an entire chapter full of information.
Right.
It's not just her giving a little bit of information. It's not just a character that pops up and says, goodbye. So far, her role has been one of lots of information that we as readers need to continue forward. And that's why I called her a mentor. Scalzi does say, Vogler does say that there can be multiple mentors, and a lot of it is information gathering. Mentors spring up in amazing variety and frequency. Because they are so useful to storytellers. They reflect the reality that we all have to learn lessons from life, from someone or something, whether embodied as a person or tradition or a code of ethics. The energy of an archetype is present, or science, or information. I feel like this information is important because it's going to come back later. As a reader, I think he needs to know these things so that he can puzzle his way through. Oh, and he'll have this insight later. Oh, they create nuclear energy. I've got an idea, and he's gonna science his way out of it, right? Like,
yeah, but when you're writing a book, all the information you're giving your audience should be useful in the service of the whole story. It's like it's the Chekhov gun idea. You're never presenting information that's not going to be useful in the story.
If she comes back in the story to give more information, would she be more of a mentor if she comes back later?
If that mentor isn't somehow affecting the personal growth of the main character, then it loses that emotional connection. And then I get bored. I'm not actually bored of the descriptions or the world building. I like that world building. But just because you're giving the audience information about the story, why is it always mentoring the hero?
I'm not saying that every character that gives the hero information is a mentor. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
What I'm saying is this particular character, an entire chapter has been dedicated to her providing information. And it is during stage 4 and 5. It's lining itself up. Now, if she appears later on in the story and she's a new character, I'm not going to say she's a mentor.
Well, we already said that a mentor is a mask, too. You can be mentor now and do something else later. So you're right.
Sure.
So maybe she is wearing a mentor mask at this stage.
Maybe, but at the same time, you have read this entire story and I have not. There might be more plot for her that I'm not understanding. And so it could be that I would agree with you after a few more chapters. I'd be like, oh, she was just a blip on the mentor radar in that stage. But right now, I'm, as a reader, gaining information and thinking, oh, there's Tom. Oh, but there's this new person. Okay, well, we've got Tom, who's the worker, and then, who comes in and gets to leave. And then there's Bryn, who never really leaves, Well, I guess she does every 6 months or so. But, yeah. I did like your comment about, the mentor should be part of the hero's growth. And if it turns out that she is not part of the hero's growth, then that would make more sense.
Yeah.
If you limit it to the mentor being part of the hero's growth. This is a very almost an academic discussion. It shows that we know our shit and we know how to talk about literature.
There's the analysis, and then there's like kind of how I feel as a writer when I'm writing stuff out.
Oh, that's an interesting take too.
Maybe one of the issues is that the archetypes are masks that characters play to have particular roles in the story that move the story along. But then there's that emotional connection that the writer has with the characters they're creating and that emotional role.
From a writer's point of view, if you have a mentor in mind and you're going to be like, this is the mentor, then that makes sense. Again, I haven't finished this book, but you have. And I'm going to keep relying on that because if you know that somebody comes back and somebody doesn't, then I might have the same opinion because I'd be like, oh, well, they're only there in a chapter and then they're just like kind of lightly around and then they get eaten or some shit, With that said, shall we move on to crossing the first threshold?
Crossing the first threshold.
Stage 5.
There are some stages that everybody has heard about. And everyone's heard about the ordinary world and the call and the mentor. And so the threshold was kind of a slightly different concept I wasn't quite nearly as familiar with when we first started. But it's that transition from Act 1 to Act 2. It's the point where the hero doesn't go back anymore. It's the point where the adventure gets real or as we said, they start throwing punches.
Yeah. One quote I thought was really good. Vogler says, "It is the most critical action of Act One."
Yeah. He uses a lot of movie examples, and things about movie examples is they really do bring home the step of the crossing the threshold. They're very visually powerful. He says that threshold is often brought through by external forces, like, a storm coming in, or somebody getting shot, or someone transitioning very physically from one place to another.
Yeah, like, let's just say a villain may kill, harm, threaten, or kidnap someone close to the hero. Mm-hmm. It's a trigger. It's like a gun going off. Something big happens in the hero's life, and they cannot turn around. And they have to commit. And this is how they commit. And it's through action.
Yeah. And he said it changes the course of the story. It changes the intensity of the story, he says. The movie examples we'll go through a bit later is that they're very obvious. This is that moment. I was thinking we did The Last Unicorn as another book we were reviewing, and that the threshold is, I think, the point where the unicorn gets captured by the circus, by the Mommy Fortuna circus, because that's the point where she can't go back anymore. Up until that point, she's wandering around getting information, but that's the point.
She had her freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the moment her freedom was taken away, that was very, very important. Mm-hmm. That was very dangerous for her. So it is a separate moment of decision. He says it's a scene. That's another thing to keep in mind. This is based on film, but I guess it could be an internal thing, but I think it would be important that this plot point, turning point, this stage be illustrated in a scene. What would you say, Kim?
Right. Otherwise, we don't actually get that moment when the hero changes their mind. Even if something's gradually going inside you, usually there's some action or some moment or some realization that drives you on. And if the hero kind of just bumbles into the adventure, and that's, some stories are obviously about a bumbling hero into it, but even then, like, the audience wants to see the hero engage. Like you were saying, you should have a scene, you should have a moment, you should have something to show the audience or the reader that this is when the change happens. You don't want the threshold to be crossed when no one's looking. You don't want to fall asleep in the car and wake up and the threshold's already passed.
Right. And then the hero has to be in charge of themselves in some way. Most of the time, there has to be some kind of active decision, or you have a really weak protagonist, right?
Yeah. Or if only I'm going to survive and run for my life at this point.
That's at least a decision.
That's a decision. That's very active.
Yeah, it's an active thing. But if they're just kind of like they blink and there they are in the world. I mean, I guess Dorothy did that, but once she was there in the other world, she made very specific decisions.
There, the threshold is, the house is trapped in the cyclone and it's flying through the air.
She goes after the dog, right? That's what did it?
Well, that was part of the action. But even if you're just simply like holding on for dear life, that's an action.
Okay.
If she fell asleep before the storm and then woke up and walked outside, then we'd have missed the threshold.
Okay.
Because that would have been passive.
He goes into more about the Threshold Guardian, which he's gone to in the past. I remember because I wrote those show notes.
Yes.
So we're rehashing a little bit.
A Threshold Guardian's a good way to make the threshold meaningful. That's somebody they have to overcome or subvert or figure out a way around or whatever. So crossing the threshold is both an action of moving into the new world, but also of some conflict or some sort of dramatic element. It's got to be big.
Yeah, he says that they tend to cluster around doorways, gates, and narrow passages. I thought that was fun. I used this example in the show notes last time. If you guys have seen Labyrinth, there's this really, in the oubliette, down below in the oubliette, when they're, Sarah and Hoggle are leaving, there's these stone pillars that have faces, and they start giving warnings. Turn back, and then they're like, warning. And Huggle's like, oh, those are just false alarms. They're just there to turn us around. And it's like, oh, yeah, Henson's playing with this idea of the Threshold Guardian.
Yeah.
And then one guy goes, I'm just doing my job. And I also like this part where he says, Threshold Guardians are part of the training, which is a different kind of training than the mentor gives, right?
Right. School of Hard Knocks.
The School of Hard Knocks. So that's what the Threshold Guardian is. It's the School of Hard Knocks.
Let mean, everything like this is a little bit nebulous. You could also say that you're already getting into the trials of the story itself.
This is a specific trial, though.
Right.
The Threshold Guardian is brought up here as one of the ways in which the hero gets kick-started into the journey. When they cross the first threshold, you could put a Threshold Guardian there, and that would signify them crossing into the other world.
If it's too easy for your hero to get to where they're going, maybe you should throw up some resistance, and perhaps a Threshold Guardian is what you need.
What was your trigger in your book?
So, on the one hand, in my book, the heroes, are magically teleported into this land, but that really isn't the threshold, because the threshold is when they actually start acting like heroes as opposed to cosplaying as heroes. And that's when they fight the cockatrices. The rescuing the sheep is the threshold that turns them into heroes.
What chapter is that?
It is like chapter 13. It's like 30,000
Holy
words in.
crap.
Yeah, it takes a while.
So the first 4 steps could take a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, you're intermixing it with the mentor. You're intermixing it with the refusal to call. I had 5 main characters that all needed training before I sent them out, which took a while. Mm-hmm. But it could have created something where they had an option to go home and they decided to stay. But it really, for my characters, they weren't heroic enough to say yes at that point. Mm-hmm. So I really kind of had to trick them into getting to that threshold point and just not give them an option to go back or to go back to the town even.
Well, that makes sense because they have to be active, right? They have to have faculty enough to make the decision. They have to know enough to make the decision to make it matter.
Yeah. And they have to have the skills to actually survive too. I think that was the main reason.
Yeah, because if they didn't survive, they would just die anyway.
Yeah.
They can't go on their adventure. That would be an easy way to end the book. Chapter 14.
That would have been a very difficult book to sell then.
Exactly. How long are your chapters?
They vary, but most are about 2,500 words.
How many pages is that?
A chapter is Microsoft Word. It's usually about 12 to 16 pages, but
okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, I guess you can take your time.
Well, it was actually a struggle when I was writing the book because part of me was like, I should be getting to the action. I should be getting to the state. I should be getting to the threshold here. And I just wasn't. When I tried to jump too quickly to the threshold, before I established the characters, before I established their abilities, it didn't feel right. Mm-hmm. It felt a little bit too weak. I couldn't get a good threshold from that.
I'm going to bring it up again. Captain America. He had a whole backstory. It took a long while for him. It was probably half hour or more into the movie before he crosses the threshold. And even then, even after he gets juiced up, a lot of nothing happens. He does ESO shows.
Well, yes, but right after he gets changed, then there's that attempt at stealing the serum and all that. And so there's a chase scene. There's a whole action. There's that spy that's trying to get the serum that kills the scientist. So that's actually a whole Threshold Guardian and a giant threshold. The threshold is when he wakes up and he's Captain America and he's dashing off after the bad guy.
Right. I don't remember that. I just remember him being the SO show and getting really antsy.
Yeah, and then he gets pushed onto the SO show.
All right, cool. See, the crossing signifies we have reached the border of the 2 worlds. So that would show the compare and contrast of one world into another.
Vogler talks about how, and this is where we're getting much more into film and theater. He talks about in theater, often after the first act, the lights would go down, would allow people the stagehands to change the set, but also it was kind of an emotional moment. Something is said, something is decided, and the lights go down, and the lights come back up, and you're in Act 2, and things have changed. There's a tradition in theater and performance to tell the audience, look, this is a big deal right here. And then he has a ton of examples that are highly visual.
It's all film.
And with music, and the camera work goes faster, and there's all these great techniques you can have in a visual media that just can really sell the point that things have changed. So it can be a single moment even.
Was there, from what I remember when reading a draft of your book, when the cockatrices show up, it's pure action at that point.
Yeah.
And that's one of the first times in the book that is pure action. And whenever I get that in a story, I read faster. My pupils probably dilate. I'm probably like, ooh, exciting. It's like the fight scene in a video game almost, where you're kind of playing with them. I guess you're getting it similar, like your heart rate is pumping.
Yeah. The way I see it, when I'm watching a TV show or reading a book, is that there's that initial kick where we get the main character, we get the setup, we get the hint of the other world, we get all that stuff. But then the story has to actually start, and it really needs to start strong. And usually it's got to be exciting.
Yeah.
Either through a fight scene or through something else. I've run into stories where they've got a great setup, they've got a great hero, and then it just doesn't go anywhere.
Interesting. To contrast this, I'm trying to think of like a literary example. Literature.
That's the thing. I mean, do you think a hero's journey works for literature? Because,
well, everything is everything, right? You can make anything match this freaking hero's journey if you wanted to. But
if you wanted to. But honestly, do you feel like a literary book has a point of no return commitment sort of thing?
I would like to say yes, but I need an example, or I'm just talking out of my ass. So, there's Handmaid's Tale.
Okay, so for Handmaid's Tale.
You've read the book?
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't really start in the ordinary world. Start with her living in that horrible, repressed society.
Yeah, but then it goes back for a chapter or two and does go back. You can do that.
Yeah.
So in the story, she starts out, she's already been subjugated. She's already having to wear the outfit. She's already in a captain's house. Mm-hmm. She's already a handmaid.
Yeah.
Then she has flashbacks. And in the flashbacks, it sets all this stuff up. And it goes through stages very similar to Kaiju Preservation Society. So the stages were, well, we're going to talk about that, but the stages were, Greenland, Honda Station, Tanaka Station. Mm-hmm. And each one, he's getting deeper and deeper into the world. The same happened in Handmaid's Tale. First, there was stuff just on the news. It's like, okay, the war, there's a civil war taking place. Then they gun down Congress. Then she goes to get her newspaper, and her cards declined because all her money has been sent to her husband, the next male, because she can't have one anymore because she's a woman. Then she goes to work, and she finds that all the positions of women have been taken by men, and they send all the women home. Like, it's a not slow, but it's a deliberate progression, just like in Kaiju Preservation, where it's going deeper and deeper into oppression until it reaches a point where they decide, we have to escape to Canada now. With our daughter, we have to go. Mm-hmm. I think I recall what happened was they were like, well, you were married before to somebody else, and that was an issue. And it was almost like, well, that man owns you or something. And then finally, father of the child, her second husband, was like, okay, we got to go. And then they try to escape, and that's their decision. We're going to fucking escape. That's when they get caught and they get separated.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the threshold. Because until that point, you're right, it's a series of stages, and they're getting deeper and deeper, and then bang, that's the point, and then we jump back to her oppressed life. But it's critical that they make that escape and they get caught.
Yes.
And that everything changes.
And that is the threshold, yeah.
So obviously you can have this kind of stuff in literature. I think maybe something more like a Sally Rooney novel or something where it's more emotional that maybe you don't have. I think a threshold means your character is going to commit, and some literature works by the idea that the character never quite commits. Because it's always that more realistic presentation of constantly making choices. In our own life, sometimes we have thresholds, but a lot of time we kind of just keep transitioning and transitioning. We can always go back a little ways and go forwards a little ways.
Right.
So a more realistic presentation would not have a point of no return as likely.
I'm starting to have flashbacks of like 18th century lit course. This actually has this, like Pamela. What was the guy, Samuel Richardson or something? It was considered perhaps the first 18th century novel. And I read it so long ago. But Pamela is a maid, like a literal maid. And so weird, her master, the guy who pays her but also owns her, keeps trying to rape her. I mean, like literally throughout the beginning. It goes in stages. He gets more forceful, more forceful, more forceful. And then there becomes a point where he makes a decision to marry her instead. And he does this because she is so virtuous, which is so fucking stupid. But right. And that is a decision. That was a threshold. And that actually kickstarts the story of this very rich master deciding to marry his maid, which would never fucking happen in real life. Then I start thinking of Moll Flanders. Jane Austen too. There are thresholds. At some point, that character commits. They give an actual no. Like, no, Darcy's a piece of shit. And then over time, changes their mind.
In Pride and Prejudice, she does turn down his offer of marriage, but that's when they start to like each other.
No. Well, I don't think that was the threshold. I think the threshold in Pride and Prejudice was at the party, and he pretty much insults her to her face. And then when she's having a conversation later, she's like, that guy is a piece of shit. Because they were specifically there to look for husbands. That was the point.
Right, but if it was a threshold, wouldn't that then kick her off to Elizabeth's never going to get married, she's going to get a career? Because in the end, they're still dancing around that whole courtship sort of thing. And she's kind of made up her mind that she's not interested in him, but he's getting interested in her.
Right, but I think because the theme has been established so strongly that it's all about marriage, the question in the reader's mind is, will she get married to this person? And her threshold is, in my journey, I'm going to say no to this specific person on this journey of looking for a husband.
I suppose so, but then she keeps running into him again
because
and again.
That's the journey. That's the story. I'm just talking about the threshold.
I suppose so. I think for modern reading, we've gotten so used to movies. We've gotten so used to that entire big moment. Mm-hmm. Which might not have been as common back when Pride and Prejudice, we didn't have that same visual kick. Like, things move slowly in that book.
Yeah, but hilariously.
Yes, stood this test of time. It's a fantastic book. I will never say anything bad about Pride and Prejudice. Thresholds are fun to read about. They really kick the book into gear.
They're one of the most entertaining moments in the book.
They're thrilling. I wrote they were thrilling.
There's a couple quotes I liked. One was, the crossing takes a certain kind of courage from the hero, even if that means running away. But then he says, the special courage is called making a leap of faith, like jumping out of an airplane. The act is irrevocable.
Mm-hmm. I wrote down leap of faith, too. That thrill, that moment of like being a hero, too. Mm-hmm. I mean, part of being a hero is that you're willing to make that jump. You're making that commitment. You're willing to do something that not everybody would do.
Yeah, you are a hero, and a hero has to do certain things, and that's one of them. And if you don't, we normally don't like that kind of story because that protagonist doesn't have agency.
The other example you had was the rough landing idea, and the idea that maybe you jump into this world, but part of the threshold is realizing it's not what you think it's going to be, but you're still in it. Yeah. You still made that choice. You're still acting. You're still running for your life, whatever. You're crossing a threshold. It just might be it's not what you were expecting or the audience was expecting.
Right.
And some of these are much worse.
Yeah. One of the examples I put in the show notes, if you guys are really interested in Threshold Guardians, the character of the Threshold Guardian, of the person constantly being confronted and having to try to refuse the call over and over again and failing, is Wolverine. I learned this while doing the show notes, looking for examples, and because I love Wolverine, and also it's timely because of the movie. Notice how many times he says no and fails to avoid adventure. It is part of his character. It is the plot of any Wolverine movie. I felt very clever that I figured that out. I was like, holy shit. And then I went, that must be why I like him, I suppose, because he's my favorite Marvel character. So anyway.
So in Kaiju, as we've kind of already alluded, we have a number of stages as they're getting closer and closer to threshold. We said earlier that threshold crossing could be a single moment or it could be kind of an extended set of things. It felt like there was actually a couple of places where you could say they crossed the threshold. Because the big visual one is when they step into the base and the lights go out and the lights come back up and the door opens and suddenly they're no longer in Greenland or not our Greenland. It's like suddenly they're in a jungle and it is hot and humid and there's more oxygen in the air and it's just like, what happened?
Yeah.
And then they look up and they see a kaiju fly overhead.
Yeah.
That's a pretty serious threshold visual that he's given us.
It'll look great on the TV, on the movie screen.
It'll look fantastic on the movie screen. I'm also kind of curious to see what the kaiju look like because he never quite describes what they are.
I mean, there's different kinds.
Well, you haven't got as far into it yet, but this is one of the interesting things about the book. Is he actually look and say, well, what does the kaiju that he sees look like? Like, some have wings, some are like big as buildings, some of them like move like mountains, but
I imagined that they look like lizards, partly because in chapter 7 or 8, they talk about how there are no mammals in this world, and there's no birds. There's like bacteria, and there's frogs, there's reptiles, and there's these kaiju. So they're dinosaur-like.
So it's interesting to see how you think they look as you go along. They're never really detailed. Like he never gives you a play-by-play by exactly what they look. He gives you parts and bits of them, but never the whole thing. It'll be fun for the monster designer for the movie. So there's that moment, but while they physically are stepping into the world, there's not a huge excitement moment. Like there's no danger. There's nothing. They are on the base and they are...
Well, there is a bit.
Right when they walk out at that stage?
Oh, no, not when they walk out.
Because the danger comes, Scalzi does add danger. And that's in the next chapter where they are traveling on the Shobijin dirigible.
That looks really scary.
That looks really scary. Which isn't the crossing the threshold. The crossing the threshold is when they're flying out and they accidentally get caught in between two angry kaiju.
Yeah, throwing pieces at each other and almost killing everyone.
Yes.
In the thing.
Yes.
I just want to talk about, for a second, this idea of the stages building up to the threshold.
Okay.
Vogler doesn't talk about that. It's also something I didn't even think about until we started talking, and now I'm really fascinated in terms of storytelling. Is this a moment of like cause and effect? You have to like explain how that big threshold happens, and you have to build that through these stages, which is why it took you 13 chapters to get there. My brain is just like, oh my God, flashbacking to a bunch of stories. The stages just get, or is it just increasing the stakes?
A lot of it's increasing the stakes, but a lot of it's like, you're building one on top of the other so you can get to something truly amazing. And so your audience only absorbs so much at each stage. So you're prepping them. You're setting things up. You're getting them to Greenland. Their phones no longer work. They have to get rid of their clothes, put on these other clothes, they have to take a shower and wash everything 3 times. And that all builds to something. And then they walk out and they're someplace else and that builds. And then there's a kaiju and then there's a this. And you're right. You're building up so that when we get to that scene where suddenly there are 2 kaiju throwing stuff at each other and throwing bits of each other at each other and the dirigible's like trying to escape, it just hits you. And that wouldn't hit if they'd walked out on the plank there and suddenly there was a kaiju attacking.
I mean, it wouldn't work.
We wouldn't be as prepared for it. We wouldn't enjoy it as much because we'd be still scrambling to understand what the heck's going on.
That's true.
Too many things at the same time. That way Scalzi took time to explain exactly how wild this world was, how untouched by civilization, how utterly not Earth it was. So that then when the monster attacks, you know that you're not in Earth.
Right.
The stakes are higher.
Right. And it's also, I think, important to note that, the story arc, that traditional story arc where things just get crazy, 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 that is, I think, too simplified of a way of looking at conflict and plot. What Kaiju's doing is it goes up and down, right? It's like, oh shit, there's kaiju. Oh crap, we almost died. And now we're in a conference room talking about the science of kaijus.
Right.
We're in safety. So it goes to holy shit to safety, to holy shit to safety. But I'm assuming that every holy shit moment, don't let your kids listen to this episode, that moment, that's where the conflict gets higher than the one before it, perhaps.
Right. So you have to build up and up and up. So that's why, you start off with seeing the kaiju and then you got the kaiju fight and you're almost dying. I found that chapter to also be a thresholds chapter, even though our main hero is not doing anything but just watching out the window. So that was a bit more passive than perhaps some conflict. But at the same time, when your monsters are like 10, 20 stories tall and your hero has no experience whatsoever, you really can't like give them a weapon to have them start fighting. It wouldn't make any sense. Or have them running for their life in a brand new world they know nothing about.
Right.
It just wouldn't be realistic. And I mean, part of what makes this pleasurable is that you can almost kind of believe it's happening.
It makes it more believable.
All the little references, all the facts that things that people can and can't do just makes it feel less like a superhero story, more like normal person thrust into a weird Jurassic Park sort of world.
Lit sci-fi major with a master's degree who had to work as a deliberator during the pandemic.
There's one other threshold, and that's really a threshold, but when they do get to the base after they survive, they get a party.
They do. They show up and there's all this alcohol.
And there's also even a passing, the ship that's leaving comes out and they hand them alcohol and they hand them funky clothes and hats and ukuleles, and there's a big party, and then gifts are given. It's not a serious thing. It's safe.
It's a ritual. Passing of the torch.
Mm-hmm. It's a threshold there. They're walking onto the base.
Wow, Scalzi's really good at this journey thing, I just got to say.
And, the other way you look at it, you see, you're talking about stages. You first get the awe of the world. Then you get the thrill and terror of almost dying. And then you get a party. You get fun stuff. A little reward.
Yeah, that's true.
But each of those scenes gets Jamie further into the world, into this adventure.
Right. I really like this idea of the stages. In terms of plot development, I feel like a little light just kind of like hit me.
One thing people talk about, or one thing when I'm reading a book and makes me want to keep reading it, is when I have confidence in the author and them knowing what they're going to do. And Scalzi's 3 stages here, as he moves us through, just gives me a confidence that he knows what this world's about. He's going to lead us through and he's going to let us know what's happening, and there's going to be action, and the confidence that he shows the stage. It's pretty great. I don't think it's the hardest thing to come up with a crazy opening to something or a call and, transferring out of the ordinary world to something else. But when an author can then nail the transition and keep the energy going, then it's going to be a good story. Mm-hmm. Because it's not going to drop off at that point. Or I suppose it could drop off at any point, but at least not there.
Yeah. Man, Scalzi, man. This is a good novel as a primer for writing a very cinematic-like novel, but almost any reader can pick up and really just get right into it.
Yeah, and Scalzi was really good when we were doing the cause and effect too, because we used his red shirts for that, and it fit really well.
Oh, that's right. This is before I learned much of anything. This was early on in the...
Before we got prepared and decided to pick out books ahead of time, we were just running through our shelves to try to find something.
Yeah, I picked up the book. I'm like, oh, look, that probably has what we're looking for because it's a mass market paperback.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very long episode for 2 very thin chapters.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you guys all for listening. And if you enjoyed this show and you go to our website, there's a little spot where you can leave us a tip.
Yep. A tip would be great. A coffee, whatever. We put a lot of work into the show notes and we put a lot of work into the podcast.
We're going to a con fairly soon and we're paying for that. And to help promote the podcast and our writing. And so a little bit of help would be great.
If you feel like this has helped you, the book's advice and us talking about the books and all these other things, it would be really awesome. It would be like a nice gift. Also, if you can't do that, that's okay. You can email somebody and say, or text somebody, hey, have you checked out this podcast? That would be really helpful.
Yeah, we would love to get more people listening to the podcast. I think it's some good, really interesting stuff we're covering in structuring an adventure story.
Yeah, we think this would be really helpful to other writers.
Yep.
All right, all. It was fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga Adam. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
And her friend is giving her faces oh, no, not that one. Oh, no, not that one. Until they get to oh, yeah, that's the dress. You know what I'm talking about?